Hi, and welcome to our webinar on people in emergencies. I'm Mike Drayton, and with me is...
Hi, I'm Steve Nimmo.
We're both really excited to tell you about the new course that we've developed here at the Emergency Planning College. It's called People in Disasters. But before I tell you about it, I'd like to begin with a story, a true story, the story of Aberfan. It's Friday, the 21st of October 1966, and we're in the village of Aberfan in the heart of the South Wales coalfield, and it's cold and it's raining. It's been raining for weeks now. It's 8:30 and mothers are waving goodbye to their children as they leave for another day at school. The local school, Pantglas Junior School, stands in the shadow of a massive slag heap that looms 1/4 of a mile high. Recently, the slag heap has started shifting and a strange crater has appeared in the top. Deep underneath the tip is a tiny spring whose flow has been swollen by the unrelenting heavy rain. It's slowly leaking into the tip, turning the solid cold slag into soft and unstable slurry. The local community has expressed their worries about the changes in the tip to the National Coal Board, but these have been ignored or brushed aside with a paternalistic, "Don't be silly, the tip is perfectly safe." It's the morning assembly now, and the children are singing All Things Bright and Beautiful. The children are excited because the school is due to finish early at midday for the start of the holidays. The children are sitting at their desks now, and as the teachers begin taking the register, the slag heap begins to shift, move and rumble. All of a sudden, the bottom of the tip shoots out and the whole tip begins to slide like a massive black tidal wave towards the school. In Pantglas Junior School, the lights begin to flicker and sway. The children hear a roar as the glistening black avalanche consumes and buries the school. Had the slide happened an hour earlier, or 4 hours later, the building would have been empty. But it didn't, and the school was full. 116 children and 28 adults lost their lives. I'd just like to pause now, and I'd like to take a look at the picture. It almost looks like it's a picture of a collapsed building, but it isn't. What you can see is the roof of the school buried under the landslide. After the landslide stops, local people rush to the school and begin digging through the rubble, moving the rubble using their bare hands and garden tools. At 9:25, the police receive a call from a local resident who says, "I've been asked to inform that there's been a landslide at Pantglas. The tip has come down on the school." The first miners from Aberfan Colliery arrived within 20 minutes of the disaster, having been brought up from underground where they'd been digging coal. The miners direct yearly digging, knowing that any unplanned excavation could lead to more slides. The miners work in organised groups under the direction of the pit managers. Later, an official inquiry placed the blame for the disaster squarely on the National Coal Board. The organisation's chairman, Lord Robins, was criticised for making misleading statements, at first saying that the NCB was unaware of the spring, but later admitting that they did know about it. Robins was also criticised for not going to the disaster scene immediately, instead attending a ceremony installing him as Chancellor of the University of Surrey. Despite its negligence, neither the National Coal Board nor any of its employees were prosecuted or fined for the disaster. The Aberfan Disaster Memorial Fund was set up on the day after the disaster. It received contributions totalling £1.75 million from all over the world. Now this was an enormous sum in 1966, but clearing up was paid for by a government grant and a forced contribution of £150,000 taken from the Memorial Fund. This enraged the survivors. The money was for the families, not the government. In 1997, the British government paid back the 150,000 to the fund. The families also campaigned for the removal of other tips that posed a threat to local communities. These tips were removed only after a lengthy fight by Aberfan residents against fierce resistance from the NCB and the government on the grounds of cost. There was a mass burial on the 27th of October on the steep hillside cemetery that overlooks the village. Flowers and wreaths from all over the world were laid out in the shape of a huge cross as flags flew at half-mast across the nation. The funeral was attended by the Queen and Prince Philip. In the months following the disaster, problems began to emerge in the community. While some families mourned the loss of one, maybe two children, others tried to comfort survivors. Children terrorised by nightmares. Local GPs were asked for help for older children who'd started wetting the bed. Children who became withdrawn or began behaving strangely. Long married couples got divorced. Alcoholism became common. Most people were frightened or angry or both. People unexpectedly died before their time. The symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder began to emerge, but in 1966 there was little understanding or recognition of PTSD. In 2003, 37 years after the tragedy, research published in the British Journal of Psychiatry found that half the survivors of the Aberfan disaster had experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. 34% of survivors reported that they still experience bad dreams or difficulty in sleeping because of intrusive thoughts about the disaster. That was 1966. So what can we, in 2018, learn from Aberfan? How can the experience of Aberfan inform how we manage people in emergencies, people in disasters, now? There are three themes that emerge from this story. First, it was the local community who predicted the disaster, and their warnings were ignored by the authorities. Second, the local community played an active part in managing the disaster. It was local people who began the rescue attempt. It was local miners who organised the digging for survivors. The local community actively supported and worked alongside the rescue teams. Third, it was a whole community that experienced psychological and emotional trauma, and I include emergency service workers in this group, as a result of the disaster. And this trauma persisted for decades. Finally, much of the distress, anger and alienation arose from the lack of communication and understanding between the local community in South Wales and the distant National Coal Board and Whitehall authorities. The real lesson of Aberfan is that managing emergencies means managing the people caught up in emergencies. Our People in Emergencies course is designed around these themes. I'll now hand you over to Steve, who will tell you more about the course.
Thanks, Mike. So what Mike has just outlined is a disaster that took place 52 years ago, and yet it remains in the public consciousness to this day. Some disasters are simply timeless, and as someone who responds to multiple fatality events, I'm always aware that whether it's 1966 or 2018, the community impact is the same. Considerable loss of life and families never the same again. Aberfan, Townsend Torreson, Marchioness, Hillsborough, Dunblane, New York, Manchester Arena, London Bridge, Westminster, Grenfell, all very different multiple fatality events, but with two very important things in common: loss of life and community impact. Mike and I first spoke with the people here at EPC about providing this course because we believe there is a genuine need to better prepare communities to respond in the event of a major emergency or disaster. Many years of working with people in these situations have taught us that empowering those people who are directly affected by something can have a positive impact on their recovery. This webinar is designed to give a flavour of what will be a 2-day intensive course. Today, we will give an outline of the psychosocial aspects of emergency management and how local communities receive support following a major incident. We'll give an overview of the required knowledge and confidence required to actively engage with the community. In other words, what can the authorities do not to sideline the affected community, but to bring them front and centre to the response? We want you to gain a better understanding of local resources and how they can be mobilised to best effect, to understand that there are often resources that go unused instead of spending thousands of pounds bringing in those same resources from outside. And above all, we want you to better understand how engaging with the community can limit the psychological and social damage in the short, medium and long term. Our main objective today is to briefly explain the purpose, value and methods of effective community engagement prior, and that's the important word here, prior to an event taking place. Proactive is always going to be better than reactive. We want to outline effective communication strategies used to support communities caught up in a major event. All too often, people who are affected feel like they're being sidelined, talked over, and in the end, they become disengaged. How often has control of an incident been lost, all because those who are suffering the most are not receiving the support they need? People may have physical wounds, people may bleed, and in which case they will receive immediate treatment. But what about those who aren't showing any physical signs? Take a look at the MH370 response as an example. There you've got a group of people who very quickly became disengaged because they were not being treated properly by the authorities. They were not being kept fully informed of what was going on, and so they mobilised themselves. So we're going to talk about how to establish good practice that can be used to enable a sustainable, community-focused recovery process. When I deploy as part of a disaster management company, my focus is always on when are we going to complete the work. And when do we look at that? We look at that before we start the work, because we're always monitoring the community and at what point we can actually hand over to them to continue their own recovery. And finally, we'll touch on how all of this can greatly assist with helping to sustain a positive reputation throughout an incident beyond. For those of you that are old enough to remember TWA, Pan Am, and the likes of those airlines, they no longer fly, and the reason, or one of the reasons, is simply because of the way they dealt with the disaster when it happened. Their failure to look after the people that were affected most. And in the case of TWA, there is a perfect example of how not to handle a community post-incident. People were not being informed, the press knew things before the families knew, and so they made it their business to ensure that TWA ceased to exist, and in the end, they achieved that outcome. So now, Mike, back to you.
So, like all courses at the Emergency Planning College, this is an intensely practical course that's focused on outcomes, good outcomes for you, but more importantly, good outcomes for the communities you serve. So, how can we improve outcomes for a community following an emergency? Well, the course looks at 3 distinct phases in which, if you can make even small changes in how you work with the community, this will have a significant impact on how well individuals and the community as a whole will recover from that emergency. The 3 phases are before the emergency, during the emergency, and after the emergency. Like Steve said earlier, our approach is proactive rather than just reactive. And so the process of recovery, in our eyes, begins before the emergency. It begins by taking time to understand your local community and build relationships. That process starts by reflecting on some simple questions, one of which is, what is a community anyway? And Steve will be talking about that in a moment. Second, if the community are actively engaged in the emergency response, then relationships are built and consequently trust and understanding is built. Another question is, why are the general public sometimes sidelined or excluded? There are lots of good reasons for this, like health and safety, but there are also some myths about how resilient people are and how people respond in emergencies and disasters. And these myths are psychological barriers to trust, and I'll say more about that later. Finally, there's the recovery phase. This is where the relationship building you will have done earlier really comes into its own. We've got three basic assumptions on this course. The first one is, we think it's very important that communities and individuals are empowered. That we, as emergency responders and emergency planners, don't just swoop in, take over, and then when all the drama's over, abandon that community. This is why we think people should be actively engaged in delivering emergency responses, both during and following the emergency. And finally, we think that communities should be trusted with accurate information about the emergency. This is a 2-day intensive, interactive and immersive course. We can't cover everything here, but let's dip into the course. And I'll start by asking Steve, well, what is a community? What's all that about?
Okay. Well, if you look at it from the point of view of the actual meaning of community, then there we have it. It's a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common, a condition of sharing or having certain attitudes and interests in common. So what I'd like you to do is just think for a minute about your family. And while you do that, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about mine. So I come from your typical 2.4 background. I'm probably the 0.4, and I've got a mum, a dad, and I have a sister. My sister's now married, and she's actually about to celebrate her 25th wedding anniversary. And she's got a little girl called Phoebe, who's 7. My mum and dad have been married 50 years, my grandparents were 57 years, and my great-grandparents were 69 years. I'm divorced, so I'm actually the black sheep of the family. So that is the core of my family. Well, if you add into that, I've got an ex-wife, I've got 2 stepsons, and my ex-wife is now married again. Now, her husband refers to all of us as a modern family because we all get on very well, and so, we all just, we all gel together. But then think about my partner. Well, my partner's background is in Zimbabwe, so she has a family that she always just refers to as like, they're the crazy people, and so that's kind of now part of my family. And if you think about that sort of expansive group of people, all from different backgrounds, and believe me, on my partner's side with many different opinions, that is a community in itself. And while we may not think of our families as communities, they do actually reflect what's around us. Every community is different. Take a tour of the UK, and you'll not find 2 communities alike. Why not? Well, because it's all about people. But not just that, it's about geography, demography, race, religion, class, money, and so on and so on. So just like in your family, there are leaders and there are those who are led. In my family, my father is the head. It's him who we turn to in times of trouble or if we need advice. But in my partner's family, it's mum who is very much in charge. But how would we know this unless we take the trouble to find out? And so it's with the wider communities in which we live. Whenever I deploy to a major incident, whether that's in the UK or abroad, the first person or people I'll seek out is a community leader. That might be a priest, an imam, a chief of police, a counsellor, but someone who can talk me through the community that I've just landed in. I need to know who are the most influential people in that community, the gatekeepers, if you like. So people who can help me integrate my team and provide the most positive levels of support that we can. So what role do these people fulfill on a daily basis which may prove useful to me? In other words, what can these people do for me? Where are these people based, and are they geographically useful? If not, I need to make them so. I need to bring them closer. And where are these people relevant to others in the community? It could be a church, it could be a school, it could be a mosque. Just last year I was very privileged to spend some time in Oman on behalf of the EPC, and I was taken to the mosque for Friday prayers, and I was absolutely astounded by the number of people that come together in that moment. The men all file in very quietly, and they're there for one specific purpose. And they've all come from different places in the area, but there they are, a community within itself. And they all look to that one person for guidance in that moment. And finally, I'm going to be asking myself, how can this community work together to provide a better response to what has happened? What framework can I create that will give these people a fighting chance of coming out the other end intact? Different for sure, yes. Bruised, absolutely and certainly, but intact. Now, one of the things you may hear talked about quite a lot is a thing called community mapping. So here we have the definition of it. It's the use of mapping technology to identify, understand, analyse, resolve and disseminate community issues with the explicit intention of education, engagement and empowerment. But the main thing is it's something that we try to do in advance. So just for a moment, I want you to imagine, or actually if you've got paper in front of you, you can do this for real, a blank sheet of paper. In the centre, you're going to write the word community and put a circle around it. And from that, you're now going to have a number of stalks which lead to the leadership headings. So this might be church, mosque, school, local authority, hospital, and so on. And then from those headings, further stalks which break down the leadership in those places and the structure of those places. And by the end of the process, you'll have two things. First, you'll have a community map. And second, and much more importantly, you'll have a clearer understanding of how that community is made up. And by having that, you will ultimately understand how that community can serve itself in the event of a major incident. One of the areas I've done some work over the last few years is Jersey. Now, there is an island where they have worked very hard to engage the community in what would happen if we encounter some major incident. The police, the fire, the hospital, local leaders have all come together to take a close look at what they will do if something should happen. And it's worth pointing out, we always say if something should happen, but actually in our world, it's not about if, it's about when. So in my line of work, I'm usually responding when something has already happened. But believe me, proactive is better than reactive. I'll still have to respond, but I can assure you that my response and that of my team will be greatly enhanced if you can present me with the map that we've just talked about. And we always say, get to know your community in good times, because it will greatly enhance your choices of a positive recovery in bad times. And remember, people don't fundamentally change themselves when something bad happens. They're still the same people, and human nature means people want to be doing something positive. Perfect example, when some years ago we deployed to an air crash out in Cyprus. We set up the Family Assistance Centre, as we always did, and we waited. And nothing happened. And the reason nothing happened is because the community supported itself. And so by moving ourselves into that community, we were better able to support them. So rather than people coming to us, we went to them. Mike.
There are a lot of obstacles that prevent us from engaging with the community and in encouraging communities to help in responding to emergencies. I think one of the main obstacles is that of beliefs and myths that people have about how the general public responds to emergencies. So let's look at some of these myths. We'll look at three, and let's do some myth busting, shall we? So the first myth that I'm going to talk about is that people involved in emergencies are generally immobilised by fear and helplessness and are in fact paralysed by events. Now this might happen in some very large scale disasters, where the infrastructure has been destroyed over a large area, but it's very far from the general case. I remember the first major incident that I deployed to, and that was a long time ago now. It's the Clapham rail disaster. And when we turned up, and we were amongst the first people to arrive, the casualties from Clapham weren't being taken care of by the ambulance service or the police or the fire service. They were being taken care of by pupils from the Emmanuel School. The teenagers had seen the crash and come running out in the classrooms and were caring in a very calm, professional and decent manner from these people who've been involved in a rail crash. They weren't running around like headless chickens or panicking or anything like that. So the idea that people caught up in emergencies are immobilised by fear is a myth, because people caught up in emergencies are the first people to take action, and I'd say they're the real first responders. Interestingly, both survivors of emergencies and professional first responders have got similar psychosocial needs. Everyone in the dynamic of responding is at risk of psychological and emotional problems, both members of the public and members of the emergency services. Another common myth concerns panic. It's widely believed that members of the public panic following an emergency incident. When I say panic, I mean an acute fear reaction characterised by loss of control, followed by irrational fight or flight behaviour. Now, there's lots of research and anecdotal evidence that shows panic is rare following an emergency incident. The research evidence tends to suggest that the people are often kind of stunned and mildly confused in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, but then they quickly figure out what's happened and usually show remarkable altruism and an ability to behave in a rational and calm manner. Some people even put themselves at risk in order to care for strangers. There's a very interesting piece of research done on the people who survived the 2005 London bombings that shows this. Now, let's skip back for a moment to one of the old photos from Aberfan. Take a close look at this picture. What do you see? First, how many people in the picture can you see are people wearing uniforms? Hardly any. The members of the public, the miners. Second, look how organised they are. They're all in neat lines helping. These people are not rushing around panicking. The last myth I'm going to briefly talk about, and Steve's already mentioned, is the idea that community recovery is always reactive following an emergency. I mean, how can you help a community recover from something that hasn't yet happened? Well, if we look back at the Aberfan story, we can see that had the authorities, the National Coal Board, understood the local community in South Wales and had a good relationship with them, the outcome following the tragedy would have been much more positive. Perhaps we can also see this in the Grenfell Tower fire disaster. The task of community recovery starts before any emergency. It starts by really understanding your community and building relationships with that community, especially, as Steve has already said, with the influential people in that community. If an emergency then happens, of course we all hope and pray that it won't, then you will be much more prepared, both in terms of dealing with that emergency and helping the community to recover. This is the main focus of our course. I'll now hand you back to Steve, who will tell you more about the benefits of this approach and, of course, the benefits of our course on people in emergencies.
So, really this is about preparation, it's about being prepared, and I mean the benefits are obvious. But just to run through, that the community has a duty of care to itself. If you can't look after yourselves, then how can you expect others to look after you? And there is no other better way to understand a community than from within. No community understands itself better than itself. We have an ethical responsibility to to ensure community is looked after. We don't just leave people to flounder. We have a responsibility to look after them. And as I've said before, knowing a community's resources can make the financial management of a response so much more efficient. And it's often about money. Any kind of incident response is extraordinarily expensive. And so to know that you have resources sat there that could be used for an incident and they just go untouched when you've paid out money for resources to be brought in makes the financial management of any kind of incident very, very important. And we've touched on this before with the airlines that we mentioned previously, but the impact on the reputation of a community, both the one directly affected and on a national scale, can be widespread and long term. Just think about it. When we talk about places in the UK, something like the place like we talk about Hillsborough. Hillsborough's a football stadium, but we always will reference it to an incident. Dunblane is another one. Hungerford is another one. All of these places that we talk about, we will always reference as places that we remember where something happened, not the fact that they're beautiful parts of the country. So reputational damage is very prevalent, and it's something that we need to be very, very aware of. So why choose the course? Well, first and foremost, who wouldn't want to spend 2 days with Mike and I? But in all seriousness, this is an opportunity to address weaknesses in your current systems. Now, anyone who can sit there and say there are no weaknesses clearly won't understand the systems. There are always going to be weaknesses. But would you not rather address those weaknesses in a classroom environment than when you're confronted by some kind of major incident? You're going to be on the course with people who have very similar needs to yours. And so engagement with others who are addressing very similar issues will give you that opportunity to share some common goals. Planning before the event and being proactive. We've said it before. We would much rather be proactive than reactive. So the chance to sit in a calm, controlled environment and put plans together is far more important than being confronted by something when the time comes. The number of people I speak to who they wouldn't even know whether they have an emergency plan, let alone where to get their hands on it. I did ask one person once and they told me that they knew the file was blue. Well, that's about the sum total of their understanding of their emergency planning. It's not going to be much help when you've got yourself involved in a major incident. We're here to address concerns in that controlled environment. We're here to have an open and honest debate about what is needed within your own communities. And there is nothing better than shared experiences. One of the things that Mike and I bring to this is considerable experience of actually deploying to these kinds of incidents. And so the anecdotal evidence that we can bring to the course is a fundamental part of it, because we can all learn from the experiences, good and bad. It gives you access to experts who have this direct practical experience of the issues. And believe me, we may do some talking, but you're going to do more. And so it is an active and interactive and engaging experience. And we want you to be the people that make the course for yourselves. So just like in the event of an emergency, of an incident where we're encouraging the community to come together to react, that's exactly the basis of this course. It's about you coming together to make the course what you need it to be. So active, interactive, and engaging is very, very important. So, in closing, first of all, thank you for listening. We both hope you found this interesting and helpful. And it's always a privilege for us to share our experiences with others. But as we do close, I want to share this one final thought with you. Last year, as I mentioned before, I was honoured to spend a number of weeks working with fellow professionals in Oman, and that was on behalf of the Emergency Planning College. And by the end of my time there, this group of very talented people had produced an outline plan which will be used to support a response in the event of a major incident in the country. And they were very proud of the fact that they were the ones that put the plan together. Not me, under guidance, yes, but they were the people that put the plan together, and they're very proud of that. And I really did enjoy my time with them. And so recently, somebody sent me through this little edict from the Sultan there, who it was in celebration of the 48th Renaissance Day, and His Majesty Sultan Qaboos issued this edict, which I think sums up beautifully what we've been talking about today. Because the real wealth of any community is made up of its human resources. They are the power that achieves development in all walks of life. They are indeed the power behind ever-changing ambitions, and they are the way towards glory, dignity, and success. And now we have some time, I think, for Mike and I to take any questions that anybody might have.